Welcome to Redeemer Lutheran Church. I'm Pastor Gary Lodeholt. This week we're walking through Genesis and looking at 4 generations in one family and how God's story of salvation and promise is lived out through them. And today we come to the scoundrel of the group. I've said often that if you invited Jacob over to your house for dinner, you would probably count the silverware after he left to make sure he hadn't stolen any of it. He's that kind of guy. You may remember that Jacob was one of a twin, second born to firstborn Esau. In those days, the firstborn got the lion's share of the inheritance, but Jacob wrangled the right to it from Esau. Then he likewise stole the blessing that Esau was to get from his father Isaac. And his deceitful ways continued. Because Esau was angry, Jacob had to flee, and he headed back toward his relatives in Mesopotamia. On the way, as he slept, he dreamed of a ladder to heaven with the angels going back and forth from heaven to earth. I often think that a much overlooked detail in that part of the story is that in the dream, God is standing on the earth with Jacob. And I think that says something about God not being removed far away, but right here with us. When Jacob gets to his relatives, he settles in with an uncle named Laban, who is a lot like Jacob. Jacob agrees to work for 7 years to be able to marry his daughter Rachel, and when the wedding night is over, he discovers that he's married to her older sister Leah instead. Laban tells him that the older sister had to be married first, and that if Jacob would work for another 7 years, he could marry Rachel. He does, and eventually when Jacob decides to go back to his homeland in Palestine, he ends up tricking Laban out of the best of his flocks and herds. And about this time you start to think, and God is working through these scoundrels? When Jacob nears where Esau is living, he fears that Esau is still angry, so he puts Leah and her children across the river and about a half a mile away. Then he puts Rachel and her children just on the other side of the river for the night, but he himself stays on this side of the river. His thought is that if Esau comes to kill them, he will hear the sounds of his family being killed and get away himself. Not a very nice guy. That night, Jacob wrestles with God and ends up with a new name. From here on out, he is called Israel. Interestingly enough, it seems that this encounter with God changes Jacob too. From here on out, he's no longer the deceitful scoundrel we saw early on. Well, Esau does come, and their reunion is marked by forgiveness and restoration. Israel and his wives have 12 sons, and those become the heads of the 12 tribes of the nation of Israel. He continues to prosper with flocks and herds and fields. Jacob's story ends when he is old and he travels to Egypt, where one of his sons, Joseph, saves the family from a famine. But that's tomorrow's story. Still, we are left with that question we asked earlier. God is working through this scoundrel? The promise of God is going through this rogue instead of his upright brother? Interestingly, yes. And from that, we learn several very important things. God is inscrutable. We can't know the ways or the mind of God, and God will do what God will do. Secondly, God's promise moves forward, perhaps in spite of us. You see, God's promises are dependent on God, not on us. God will bring out God's purpose no matter how we get in the way, and no matter how bad our character. Even in spite of us, God does something new. And thirdly, God works through people we'd never expect or choose. God sees things in us that we don't see or fathom, and it is through fallible, weak, deceitful scoundrels that God sometimes works. Sometimes, even through fallible, weak, deceitful scoundrels like us. Thanks for watching, and remember to let this day belong to God.